determine the budget. So this is where we're going to actually create the cost baseline so management can determine the project's budget. And we're going to use a tool and a technique known by PMI as cost aggregation, or adding everything up. And that's sort of that term that you see there. So we'll take the estimates in this previous process and we'll create the baseline. And this is how we monitor and control the project. So baselines, all baselines are approved. All right, so we'll look at these tools and techniques. All right, we'll look at contracts. Now we're going to take that into account. We're going to take the cost estimates that we just created in a bevy of other documents. We'll use cost aggregation. We'll analyze this data. We'll look at historical information. We're going to look at all these tools and techniques. And then the output will be the cost baseline. So let's jump in. Let's start with the output. Start with the output and work backwards. So the cost baseline, it's the final approved version of the project budget. And this is what authorizes, this is the amount of money we're authorized to spend. So here's the idea. If you remember when we estimated activity cost in the last process, we did contingency reserves, right? We looked at those costs and we said we need to add a percentage of cost or a set dollar amount, right? So we did reserve analysis. That's a tool or a technique. And we got cost estimates. That's what this figure represents here. So all of our cost estimates there. Okay. Now we roll all of these up into this work package here. So now it's all rolled up into a work package. And in this process here, while we're determining the budget, we are going to do reserve analysis again. And we're going to add even more contingency reserves. And now this final figure here becomes our cost baseline. This is what we use. It may roll up to a control account. You may or may not be using control accounts. Maybe you just have a product backlog, who knows? But if it does, either way, that's what rolls up into your cost baseline, right? So we do contingency reserve twice. We will perform reserve analysis twice. In Chris, you may be more versed than I in the construction field here, but in my experience, we'll have the what they call allocated reserves, and that'll be for a specific part of the project. Let's say if an activity slips or we make a mistake, allocated reserves here, and then we'll have unallocated reserves for like the entire system if something goes wrong during commissioning or something like that. So that's just another way of looking at this, where they call these allocated reserves when you're looking at this specific activity, and then unallocated reserves when you're looking at the deliverable as a whole. But either way, for the exam, just know that you do it twice, and that's what becomes your cost baseline. This is what we call the project budget today. What we all know as PMs as project budgets, it's really the cost baseline for PMI. And then this is the management reserves, and we don't know what this number is. So this is the idea that, let's say, if you're doing a project for a client and you're creating a product for them and they want to make changes and the changes cost money, they'll sign a change order and you'll be fine. And that'll roll up into the cost baseline. You'll get approval and you'll readjust the cost baseline. But if internally your team makes a mistake, and you couldn't account for that, you don't have any contingency reserve on that, the client's certainly not going to pay, your company's going to end up paying. In this case, that's where the management reserves come from. And we don't always know what that number is. Like, management doesn't say, hey, I've got, 25% of your project budget sitting aside for you. We don't know that, right? So we don't own the project budget for this exam. So just remember that. Project budget is owned by management because they know how much they'll allocate. Cost baseline is owned by the PM. Cost baseline contains contingency reserves, C&C. Project budget contains management reserves. Yeah? All right, really, I got to beat that home because the exam loves to try to trip you up on this too, right? So just remember, PMs own the cost baseline, which contains contingencies, right? The C&C, cost baseline contingencies. Okay? That's the key output. That's what we're going to create in this process. So the cost baseline directly linked to the schedule activities. It can be, it may not be, but it can be, and it allows you to track it. This is what they consider an S curve, right? You kind of start spending money and then it flattens out as you go along, right? And so as we get to earned value management, you can see your budget at completion, right? You can have estimates, and you can use this diagram to show many different things. You can start adding portions on it, but you see the funding requirements, and this may come incrementally, right? You may not get all of your funding at once. So we see that there, funding can happen in incremental amounts. And you see the management reserves, whatever that number is, that added to the baseline becomes the project budget. To create that as an input, we would take our management plans that would say how we're going to do it, right? How are we going to actually determine this budget and what resources we're going to use? And right, we would have used that. We would have used any business documents that would have come up, right, to help us out, specifically the business case that describes what type of return we ought to be getting on this. What's our markup, our margin? Any contracts that we have, we got to take that into account too, because not only do we need our estimates that we see here, but then other stuff that's already been agreed upon in principle, we got to take that into account as well. Okay. Right, the tools and techniques that we use are cost aggregation, just adding everything together and rolling it up. That's all we're doing here. We may analyze the data, right? We may reanalyze some estimates to determine if they're still valid, or if we need more reserves. And then we'll look at funding limit reconciliation. This is the idea that $1 million project takes a year. We'll give you $250 a quarter. So maybe I have too much work and I have to delay my work, right? I have to reschedule work according to when I get money. But also the exam works the opposite way. You may reschedule getting the money. You may need 300K in Q1 and only 150 in Q2, and then 300 in Q3, and so on and so forth. So it works both ways, but that's funding limit reconciliation. So here is your case study. Okay. Okay. Unmute.
Bottom up.
Bottom up for Dana too. Okay. What type of reserve did the team use to factor in the risk?
Contingency.
Okay. What type of reserve will be included to account for occurrences when future work is identified that's not in the schedule but within the scope?
Management.
Got some management, some contingency. Let's see. What type of reserve will be included to account for the occurrences when future work is identified that is not in the schedule, but is within the project scope? Management or contingency. So ask yourself this. Is this an unknown unknown or an unknown known?
Unknown known.
Unknown known is within the project scope.
So in that case, would we use a contingency for that or management reserves?
I'd say contingency.
You're right. Because as a PM, if I can account for it, it's an unknown known, right? It's unknown if this will happen. Well, it's known that it may happen. It's just unknown whether it will and then what the impact will be. All right. So that's a known unknown. We can account for that with contingency reserves. All right. But in this case here, it's not identified in the schedule. Not identified in the schedule. So if you have not taken it to an account on the exam, it's going to be a management reserves. So now, Dana, I agree with you that in the application of it, it's a contingency. If it's within the scope, we see it, it's going to be a contingency. When you guys read this is a reading comprehension exam, right? I'm going to tell you this right now. This exam is less about, are you a good project manager or do you know? And it's more about the reading comprehension. Ryan, did you say management reserve?
Yeah, I was.
What was the key? What was the key for you in this?
Well, that it is not in the schedule, but is within the project scope. And so it said that, when future work is identified. So that's a completely unknown at this point in time.
So what this is missing here, Dana, this type of question from PMI would have some background, like another 6 or 7 lines of text, and it would likely describe the fact that as you were creating your WBS, you missed some deliverables, right? So that and because you missed those deliverables, you weren't able to decompose those into work packages and further decompose those into activities that rolled into your schedule. So they would give you a little more clues that would help you, but they would throw it out there. But hey, you know about it. It's in your scope, and they're going to do their best to make you think that contingency reserves should take it up there, right? So when you guys get these questions, just remember 72 seconds reading comprehension exam, and you got to find that one little keyword that's going to let you know that what we're talking about.